Hey everyone, this is Latin Entertainment. My name is Francisco and welcome to Conversamos, where we have in-depth conversations about Latinidad on Abya. For this episode, we're going to discuss the Red Road, an episode dedicated to the indigenous population on Abya and how they transcend and center their culture and heritage. Enjoy!
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.
I was born and raised in Santa Maria, California. It's on traditional Chumash territory. And I was raised by immigrant parents. We were a farm working family in Los Campos de Santa Maria, picking strawberries and whatnot. Starting to U.S. Post Office. For public housing and public assistance. And so, we definitely grew up in poverty. I did not grow up learning about my indigeneity from my parents because they didn't know it themselves, which is very common for our people to not know that because we were stripped of that from generation to generation. And to identify yourself as an indigenous person in Mexico and throughout Latin America is like one of the last things you want to do is to escape racism and discrimination. And so even the education through the Mexican school system is very Eurocentric, it's very Spanish-centric. And so it isn't about teaching folks that they are also indigenous. And I think it also relates back to the reasoning as to why we aren't taught that, right? So that we don't come to the understanding that we have a blood right to the land. And so that's done purposefully. It's the de-education of the indigenous people and the indigenous spirit. And so I didn't receive that. It wasn't until I went off to community college when I became involved in MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. And I started to understand, well, what is Aztlán? And understanding that Aztlán is the southwest of the United States that once belonged to Mexico, and that our ancestors, our indigenous ancestors started in, first lived in the southwest of the United States and then migrated south to the Valley of Mexico. And so then I started to look more into that and try to discover more about my identity, right? But that happened through the politicization of my intellectualism by being an active mechista, Chicana student through this student organization.
Yeah, so I was born in Queens, and the thing about Queens is that you have all of these cultures meeting together. A lot of immigrant cultures. I've met Tibetan folks. I've met Filipino folks. I've met different folks from across Latin America. And it's this wide, melting pot of the world's cultures all in one. But there's a missing part of indigenous peoples as ever having existed here. And I think that's one of the narratives of immigration, that this is everyone's land. When that lens of immigration is done through settler colonialism, that it can only be everyone's land once you've rid the natives of it. And as I grew up kind of confused about my own identity. At first, I didn't even know I was Bolivian. It was just something that was kind of strange because I was kind of estranged from the culture and from any form of politics. I grew up in a decently middle class lifestyle, so I didn't have to worry about so I stayed pretty sheltered from a lot of political stuff. But as I started growing, I started realizing there are problems in the world, of course, but there was a sense of confusion as I didn't know what type of identity or what type of way I should view the world and these problems through. As I started growing up in the public education system, there were also questions of, I started becoming more rebellious because I started realizing a lot of the lessons about history that they were giving me were BS. There was either a lot of American exceptionalism, and I started realizing that American exceptionalism was a problem for Latin America. And then I started realizing it was a problem for all of the Americas. And I was like, oh, there's a certain colonial logic that exists here that has affected Bolivia. But then I started realizing as I grew older that it also affected that Bolivians themselves had their own colonial relationship with the indigenous peoples inside there. So as I started realizing through this very weird pocket of high school public education, that indigenous, and like that indigenous peoples in some ways are dangerous to the very existence of the nation state, because we constitute the original claimants to the land, and our existence is a contestation of settler ownership of the land, because the settler myth is that there was no one here, so we can take it. But if there's someone who was there before that myth, then it just puts the whole thing out of whack. And I started realizing that happened in Canada, in the US, in Mexico, Guatemala, Puerto Rico, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Brazil, everywhere. And I started going into, and I think living in New York City, I started meeting a bunch of indigenous peoples from across like the Americas. And that was, I think, the biggest experience. I think what helped me most with living in Queens and in New York City in general, that there's so many indigenous nations that live here, that you have to have all these experiences to kind of understand that we're all in the same struggle.
Thank you, Arnold. And to share a little bit my story, being born in Bolivia, I'm adopted, and adopted to a parents, one who is half Spanish, half Bolivian, and then my mother is a descendant from England, with like 7 generations living in this country. And so where I grew up was a very suburbanized community, and very Eurocentric in those regards. You may say it's diverse, but there's still those situations. And it was until I went to college, when I went to college, I learned about my Latino roots. I learned about Bolivian roots. I learned about the connections across Latin America. It was until then and which was great, learning how to dance bachata, learning the history and the cultural symbolism. It was then when I went to graduate school, and also during a time where one of my fraternity brothers taught me about indigeneity in relation to mathematics, as he's doing as an educator, Mario Binaby. There, I was able to, really do the self-reflection of, who I am, not just as a Latino, but where did my ancestors come from? And from there, I was like, well, I am a descendant of a Mayan people. And then from there on, wherever I go, I always try and connect with indigenous peoples first, whether that's in Mexico, when I'm going to Puerto Vallarta to see my parents, always trying to connect with indigenous peoples there, or whether it's going to California, trying to see at least museums of indigenous people, seeing as much as I can. To broaden my scope of things, as well as continuously reading books, and doing research with that. And that's and so from all the beginning to like very suburban high school, where people would draw black ink all over Bolivia because that land didn't exist, to college where I learned about being a Latinidad, to further on my studies about myself, which led to my indigenous roots that I celebrate today.
For me, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and Williamsburg. That kind of helped start me down my path as well, not just with my family and seeing their culture and what their practices was through my grandmother and great-grandmother, as it relates to indigeneity and the Christian Spanish mix. They had their own way of doing things, so I kind of wondered where all that came from. And I also, growing up in Williamsburg, had a lot of access to all these other different cultures, whether it was Dominicans and seeing how they did things, and Jewish people in Williamsburg and how they did things. It kind of got me thinking about, well, where do my ancestors come from? Where do my roots come from? And so that kind of started me down my path of learning more and paying attention to my grandmother and my great-grandmother and how they did things. And so I started asking my father, and he did his research, and he passed that knowledge down to me, through books. And he always claimed his indigeneity, his Taino-ness. So I started learning more as much as I could, and got into it a little bit in college. Then I had a bad experience in my master's. Francisco, I'm sure you probably remember me talking about that. And so I just wanted to learn more and experience more of any Taino culture that still exists and people that celebrate that.
My name is Alejandro Martinez Kiawi. Was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, which is on the western tip of Texas, bordering Chihuahua, Mexico, and New Mexico. Growing up there, we saw the separation between, I lived through the separation of brown people, although I couldn't pinpoint it exactly for what it was. Going to school with children from Mexico in elementary school, throughout my high school, I mean, my public school education years, going to school with other brown children and seeing how the border divided us even on our own campuses, you know, with all the racial or discriminatory epithets that were said back and forth. I moved to Austin, and moving far from the border, you know, it was a completely strange land. The majority of the population there is Anglo, your typical white American city. And something in me over the years of growing up in there, something in me started calling me towards, you know, who I was, because for all that time that I described, I never knew who I was. I never had a way to identify myself. You know, am I Mexican? And I grew up for some reason, the word Chicano, without even knowing what it meant, somehow I felt was a put down, you know, for being a Mexican, national Mexican born or Mexican descendant born in the United States, you know, millions of definitions, you know, and there's a lot of layers that were imposed throughout those years. Am I Mexican? Am I Mexican American? I know I'm not white, but who am I? It's in a book. And it wasn't, so this took me back to El Paso, out on the streets of, there along the river of South El Paso and downtown in Segundo Barrio, where I met a little old man. He lived on the street on the side of a house on a mattress. And it was 5 hours of interviewing him where, you know, I asked him a final question, and I said, we're about to close here, the interview, because they're closing it was a community center, un comedor, you know, where they feed the elderly there from the barrio. I said, director said, he motioned to me that they're closing. So do you got any last words that you'd like to share with us? And he said, yeah, you know, there's something that I always said, you know, I've traveled north and south. I've been on the East Coast and the West Coast. And he said, you know, here in the North, the white people, you know, they call us one thing, and our people in the South from Mexico call us another thing, you know, so we feel like we don't belong, but the fact is we are natives of this continent. And he said it like that. He said, somos nativos de este continente.
You know, I really tried my very best to stay within disciplines that are about promoting our identities. So thankfully, I've been lucky enough to work within the discipline of Chicana and Chicano studies and be an educator and be able to have control over whatever curriculum I teach and how I teach it. And so what we do is we train teachers to teach through an Indigenous lens and to not be afraid to talk about indigeneity with their brown students. But I think that more of the pushback that I've received was really from my family, because they didn't learn understanding that part of identity, right? They grew up as very traditional from El Rancho, you know, very, very Catholic, very traditional, and to their knowledge, you know, somos Mexicanos, and that's it. They don't understand like the different layers of what it is to be Mexican. They, you know, to them, it's like something that happened way a long time ago, and it doesn't really apply to us because now we're just Mexican. But, you know, when I first started discovering my identity as an Indigenous woman and as a danzante, it was very difficult for my very Catholic mom to accept the fact that I wasn't a practicing Catholic anymore, and that I was just really practicing indigenous ceremonias, you know, and that was really hard for her to process as my mother, because everyone in my family is very Catholic. I'm the only one who isn't, really. And so that was hard. And so those conversations at the beginning of this journey for me with her were very, very difficult. And she, you know, she would say, why are you obsessed with people that lived so long ago? Like those things happened so long ago that they don't matter today, right? And so then I told her, well, but you're reading a Bible that's thousands of years old, and that's what you live by. So isn't that the same thing? And I also asked her, like, it's not that they lived so long ago, like we still exist. And if you don't see that in like the reflection in the mirror, then we've really lost who we are, and we're no longer honoring our grandmothers, our abuelitas, you know, who we've inherited this beautiful DNA from. And so, yeah, my experience was that. I think the anti-redness that I've experienced through institutions is the same as anti-brownness and anti-blackness, right? And on all the things that we're seeing happening around the country right now, and in the community where I'm from, in Ventura, right now we're pushing to take down the statue of Junipero Serra, you know, who is deemed a saint by the Catholic Church, but who also was in charge of establishing missions throughout California and Baja California. And we know what the missions did to the indigenous people of you know, the land. You know, they decimated their culture. There was rape involved. There was slavery involved. There was forced Catholicism involved. There was the erasure of their traditions, their language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things, right? And so right now we see the toppling of these oppressive statues coming down. And so as indigenous people in the county of Ventura, like that's what we're working towards right now too, because we no longer want to be dominated by these statues, right? That are celebrating the genocide of our people. And so, yeah, that's what we're fighting right now in society at large.
For me, most of my anti-redness experience has come from the Bolivian community itself. A lot of it is very much that you don't want to be Indian, nor should you be. No quieres ser indio ni deberías serlo, because it's usually associated with poverty, alcoholism, and like in education, or like uneducatedness, and it's the antithesis of everything you want to be, essentially. And it really much does feel that way whenever they talk about it, even though many of the people there are very indigenous looking or are indigenous, and they just cover it up. But they'll always make the little sly jokes about, oh, ¿por qué hablas moteroso? Like, why do you speak that way? Why do you replace, like, why can't you say the O or the E? Why do you say Bolivia or like caballo instead of caballo or Bolivia? And growing up in the diaspora, I never had those problems, but I started realizing that it's just ridiculous. The fact that like we see ourselves in such a negative light, and then you always have the discussions of like, you shouldn't marry, deberías mejorar la raza. You shouldn't marry someone who's like lighter skinned, because that'll make your kids look better. And the Bolivian community, and I love them to death, but like and a lot of the older folks have that type of mentality of by escaping Bolivia, you escape Indianness, and you're able to do that because you have either accumulated wealth, or you just don't have to associate with indigenous peoples anymore. And that happened a lot after Evo lost the election, or Evo won the election, but the coup happened. There was just like this sort of like bubbling rampage of like, oh, este indio, like, nos quería robar la elección, nos quería robar el país, like dictadura. And I was like, most of these folks lived through dictatorships. They know what that entailed, but somehow social democracy is dictatorship for them. And it's kind of carnivalesque when you see that type of indigenous peoples making fun of themselves, because I've seen indigenous peoples and their parties and just like different events they've gone to, and they look exactly just like Bolivians at their own like dance and like at their own dance events where they get together and like drink around like circular tables and just have fun. And I'm like, this isn't it. Like there's something wrong here. From the institutions, not much. There's more of the sense of invisibility. Being like, there's always the idea of like, you're indigenous if you're from the US or Canada, but from Latin America, you're just Latino, Latinx, mestizo. And so there's that sense of invisibility. though I have heard stories from other indigenous Latin American folks that like a lot of native North American folks did not recognize them. There was this sense of, oh, if you're from Latin America, you're Latino, and you're kind of a colonizer yourself, even towards people who recognize like their own nations. So there are these complex layers that exist, and I haven't experienced them all, but they've informed, like the ones that I've experienced and the ones that I've heard of have informed like the way I think of indigeneity, which has to be hemispheric. It has to be continental.
Thank you. And before I even share the anti-redness, growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, I was too Latino for the white people I was growing up with. When I go to St. John's with a bunch of Latinas, I actually was too white for the Latinas. So it was just one of those situations where like navigating those spaces was pretty difficult. And then when going into Grace My Indigeneity, yeah, definitely when something that Honor was mentioning with the dance groups, because I'm actually part of a capoeirist group, and we actually have our dance moves named after like Pacha, which is a dance move that's using our Mayan language or Incan language. But when it comes to politics or it comes to like the humanity of indigenous people, is either we don't talk about it, these are on our languages or cultures, and it completely erases like the culture that we're so-called celebrating, as well as the African diaspora that's influenced in Bolivia as well that isn't talked about. Other places I've seen and read, and the anti-redness is just amongst friends and family, because, you know, they see me grow up, you know, a certain way in a certain environment. So when having long hair or wearing like these types of clothes, or just the way we just like frame things from an indigenous perspective, it's just like, who are you? Where's the Cisco that I know? And it just creates an awkward atmosphere at points. The last thing I do want to add to this is something I've noticed in society, and more so in the U.S., and I don't know, they speak about this, where people like claim they're mestizaje, or they say, I'm brown, I'm proud. That, at least from what I'm understanding, has a sentiment of anti-redness a bit, because although you're claiming your brownness, brown isn't one of the constructed races that were initially created: white, red, black, or yellow. And so it's a very post-colonial frame that comforts your skin tone or complexion, but doesn't get down to the roots of the race of indigeneity. And that's something I'm kind of questioning as I continue on this road.
I've experienced a lot of anti-redness in every aspect of my life, I think, because I'm not brown enough, or I'm not red enough, I'm not this enough, I'm not that enough. I used to have long hair. I grew it out in college to represent my indigeneity. And then I went into the police department with my long hair, and I got harassed for it. I had to tell them it's part of my culture, it's part of my religion, it's part of, you know, my belief systems, for them to leave me alone. Then I went into teaching, and same thing there. I claim my Taino heritage, and I got pushed back. Oh, you're not Taino, you're not this, you're not that. You know, so in every aspect of my life, even from my family, I got from my aunt, which is my grandmother's sister. She says, "No, yo soy indio, pero tú no." And it was funny. I was like, well, Titi, how can you be something and yet I'm not that same thing? You know? So in every aspect, I've kind of experienced it a little bit. Also, like I said before, my master's class, and we had this project where we talked about our heritage, and they laughed at me. And I'm like, you know, I didn't laugh at anybody. I'm talking about my culture, and I was disrespected that way. So in every aspect of my life so far, I've experienced it to some degree, more or less.
I guess from the very beginning, I did experience anti-redness. And I think for some of us, the connotation of red is metaphorical or akin to the red road, which was like a spiritual or walking in your lifeways walk. And, you know, I mean, essentially, yeah, we're brown in different tones. And red, I think, is more metaphorical, even from my northern friends who have spoken with. And then you get the whole mestizo myth, you know, application as well from other friends too. It's like, man, we're so mixed. It's like Southern people, Southern natives are the ones that, or natives in general, like, you know, we're like, those are the people that I've got that from the most. It's like, we're mixed. I said, well, you know what? The African diaspora, it's like, a lot of them have white blood from rape, colonial admixture. You don't hear them saying they're mixed. They keep saying they're black. The majority of them do. You know, we're like the ones that deny it the most. We're the ones that are quick to say that we are not Native American. And those are the people that I've met the most, that I've had the most confrontations with. And surprisingly, you go in with this illusion of being involved in ceremonies that you're going to be embraced by your northern relatives or other brown people, other natives. And there's a few people there that are going to present themselves as an obstacle. They're going to fight. They're going to contest your assertiveness or your being there. Like, well, who are you? What tribe are you from? You know? And I think a lot of us have been seeing this on social media with Karina Rodriguez, who slapped that white woman and said that she was Native American. I mean, I've seen a lot of our people putting her down. Northern natives, they're upset. Who is she to claim Native? You know, she's not, you know, it's just created a lot of, you know, it just shows the state of confusion that we're in, trying to find the way.
And it's very true in that, you know, we have to look at history. If you know history, you know yourself. If you have no history, then you have no self, right? It's el dicho. But if you know the history and understand the reasoning behind these laws or policies, right, about the one drop. If you have one drop of African blood, then they'll call you're a black person, right? Because there can be ownership over a black person. And there could be the criminalization and the dehumanization of a black person, even if they have one drop of blood, that makes them black, right? So it's a way to have power over them. And then that's going on at the same time, right? The opposite, which is very hypocritical, in that even if we have one drop of indigeneity, we don't get to claim that, right? So, and a lot of our birth certificates, because we are Latinos or Hispanics, then on the section where it says race, they put down white for us. Like, they completely, literally whitewash our identity. This is the day we're born on our birth certificate, right? And so when we have to fill out paperwork, forms, the census, we have 4 races to choose from: Black, white, Native American, and Asian. And I think that rattles most people of Latin American descent. I don't even like the word Latin, right? And Hispanic, because even those terms erase our indigeneity because they're very Eurocentric. But, you know, like, a lot of people will, which one do I choose? I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm not Asian, and I'm not Native American. And so, the very last thing they would ever choose is Native American, right? So they end up going with white because there's no other option. And they'll, like, our people will see ourselves as white before we see ourselves as indigenous, as Native American. And then, of course, under that, you have the option to mark that you're Hispanic, right? Or Latino. And so, again, that's a way to erase our memories and erase our birthright to the land. It's about power. It's about control of the narrative. And it's worked really, really well because, as Alex was explaining, now we're infighting, right? Within our own gente, within our own communities, and then with other northern tribes or whatnot. And who are you to claim indigeneity? And who are you this? And who are you that? And so all of these false borders and divisions that colonialism has created, we've allowed for that to colonize our minds and our spirits and our identities. And so now we're at each other, questioning each other's indigeneity, right? And saying, no, you're not indigenous, I'm indigenous. You can't claim that you're Native American because this is my land. It's like, wait, where did that come from? You know, it's like, you know, like our peoples have always traveled across the continent, and we're all a lot more related than we understand that we are. So, and I'll give the example of, and I know a DNA test is not the end all for everything, but just to give you an example, when I discovered my indigeneity through a DNA test, I discovered it before then, but just what the numbers look like, it chunked it out. So it said the majority of my indigeneity is Mesoamerican, right? And then I have a little sliver of Navajo and a little sliver of Inca, right? Which tripped me out completely. I knew the Mesoamerican part. But to me, to go all the way from the Inca people to the Navajo people, and in the middle is where what I already knew of the Mesoamerican, that just goes to tell like that migration stories of all native peoples, right? And how even corn, maize, traveled throughout all of the continent, right? And so that tells us that we're related. We're all people of the corn.
One thing I noticed is that there is that opposite role between like the one drop rule for Africans, and then there's the erasure rule for indigenous peoples. From what I've read, the one drop rule was to create more slaves and to create more people to exclude from white society. That because you were English, you were considered pure white, whereas with the Spaniards, you were considered a motley type of white. Because amongst Europeans, they're ridiculous because they just fought amongst each other within these, like, during the medieval and like early modern ages. They just fought amongst each other on what we would consider very minuscule and like ideas, like, oh, you're from like the South, oh, you're Italian, you're Spanish, like, oh, you're not as like cool as us German and Scandinavian whites or whatever. And that kind of transferred into how like Anglo North American and Latin American natives see themselves. With North America, you have this purity of whiteness, this purity of like blackness, this purity of nativeness. Whereas in Latin America, you can say everyone's mixed, but that's not necessarily how everyone sees each other. It ain't no mixed race utopia like some simple liberals think it is. And that's the thing with Latin America. You're always trying to get away from your indigeneity. You're always trying to be less Indian. But the funny part is you're never going to escape Indianness, because the very fact of being mestizo means that you're always indigenous. And even compared to a lot of whites, in Anglo whites, a lot of Latino whites are in some ways infected with contaminated with an indigeneity or a blackness. That's why you're Latino, like white. That's why you're Latino. But they still can claim a lot of the privileges that like a lot of Anglo whites do. I don't want to erase that either.
I think in our case, it was first it was about excluding us and keeping us marginalized. So over the course of several centuries, getting a beat down and being renamed and reclassified. The Spaniards specifically had 20 categories of a caste system they created. And all this was done, I feel, yes, to maintain a grip on the land. And we're seeing that today. You know, the fact that they can classify us in a way that will overshadow or erase completely our ties to the land as indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, Native Americans, that is very necessary for them to maintain control of the resources, the land, keep us as a labor pool, extracting those resources, working in their stores, their mines, their factories, everything. I think that's what it's all about, is to keep us as human resource, powering their system. And if we don't realize who we are, we're doing it to ourselves. I mean, we're on autopilot. You know, we're doing it for them now. We're the ones fighting ourselves and each other. You know, we've been programmed and rewired with a self-defeating mindset. Shoot ourselves in the foot and play along with the game, because it's better to just play along than to return to living with the land and realize who we are in reality. So yeah, it's about keeping the land and the resources.
Yeah. So going to our next question, what messages from elders have you received that resonated with you the most?
I have I'll just share a couple of them. I'm so grateful and thankful that I've had the opportunity to be surrounded by amazing elders who have guided me on this path. And I always go to them for advice and for guidance, because, I'm going to be a lifelong learner. We all are. And so we can never walk on this path thinking that we know everything, because there's just no way. Our ancestors just had so much information that we're still trying to piece together, and there's no way we're going to know it all. And so, one thing is to walk on this path in a humble way, in a respectful way, and to always recognize that there's always land recognition anywhere that you go, right? That you always recognize the original peoples of the land wherever you go, and that you try your best to establish relationships with original peoples, and to introduce yourself, and to let them know that you're acknowledging that you're on their land, and that you're asking for permission to practice your own traditions, with the permission and in a humble way, so that they know that you're on their, traditional territories. So that's one thing that's always been really important to me, and I try to share that with all of my students as well, that there are indigenous protocols that we should try our best to follow, right? Because if you just go into somebody's land and there's no land recognition, then you're just as bad as a settler, as a colonizer, as whatnot, right? So this is a way to kind of undo the harm of trying to erase the history of the fact that these lands already belong to people.
I really like that, Veronica. It kind of puts that whole like POC, people of the corn, instead of people of color. I thought that was. I also heard like people of the sun as another one. But so to kind of go off that the spirituality, what one of the elders told me and a group of us was that there are many races, there are many religions, but there is one spirit, and that lives within all of us, and that spirituality is universal.
I mean, what was it? I'm a nerdy dude, so most of my like elders come from books. And I've been lucky enough to find a lot of indigenous authors who have just written, who have like had the courage and who have had the strength to write entire like libraries of books, which is incredible, because for the longest time, even into the 20th century, we're just considered illiterate peoples who can never have hope of being anything close to intellectual. But neither should we think of intellectualism as the highest point of human civilization. I mean, we created whole civilizations that span continents without the specific European rationality that came from Europe, that had this imperial drive to it. I think if I had to give a shout out, it'd be to Fausto Janaga, who is the first indigenous intellectual of Bolivia. He like born in like 1895 to an indigenous community. He was like the first one to leave his community to the university, and then he wrote, I think, about like 15, 20 books throughout his lifetime, which is incredible. I know, and I think, and his work was the one that influenced me the most, because from an indigenous person, one who had a radical prophetic fire to his tone and to his writing, there's a dialogue that he gave where it's a mestizo and an Indian talking, where he's like, who are you, mestizo? And the mestizo responds, well, what was it? I'm Spain, because what was it? The Spaniards brought me into creation. And then the Indian asks, well, what was it? What do you think of me? And it's like, oh, you're ugly. I don't want to ever be you. And then he looks at him and he's like, but we're all together in this. And then you see like, and the dialogue kind of starts breaking down like the internal battle that exists in like the mestizo's mind. And I think, and I read this when I was like 20, and it was one of the most influential type of dialogues, because it just kind of summarized summarized all the research I had done until then. And at the end of the dialogue, the mestizo says like, but where do I belong? And one of the things about Latin America is that the Indians hate the mestizos for being like kind of traitors, or just playing into the colonial game of trying to eradicate indigenous people. But in this dialogue, Fausto Rinaga is like, no, you can come back to us. You never left. You never stopped being indigenous, and we'll accept you as long as you accept us and like our tradition.
With that said, that is all the time that we have. Thank you everyone for joining us. For everyone at home, make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on all our social media outlets at Latin_entertainment. Also, you can listen to us on our various podcast platforms that vary from Anchor, Spotify, Apple Music, and more. Additionally, check out our website for various features to promote the Latin American diaspora on Abya at www.latinentertainment.org. Stay tuned as we have more episodes ahead on this show, Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the